Good morning, Newman University and the surrounding area. You're listening to 98.5 WNUW LP Aston. My name's Joe Tusio. I'll be your host for the next hour. It is a nice Monday morning, and as usual, we had another great Sunday of NFL football. Now, with the Eagles on a bye week, I guess we can pay some attention to some of the other games that were going on around the league. Starting off with the 9 a.m. game between the Lions and the Chiefs. And again, the Lions are continually struggling as the Chiefs beat them by more than 30 points by a score of 45-10. Jim Caldwell's job may be on the line. Maybe they need to make some other adjustments to the coaching staff like they did before the week started. We're going to have to see what happens along that line. Some other games. The Raiders, a up-and-coming young squad here, winning 34-20 over the New York Jets. Now, Ryan Fitzpatrick got hurt. Geno Smith was in, but he also got hurt. So they're looking for a quarterback for the team right now. But Derek Carr and the Raiders right now are looking like a very good team. I don't know if they're going to be a playoff team just yet, but they are definitely looking better than they were the previous couple years. And it's funny because every year people want to say that the Raiders are the up-and-coming team. This year they're going to do it. This year they're going to make the run. This year may actually be the year where they put it together and can make a playoff run. The Bengals and Steelers game was another tough matchup. The Steelers, for the most part, played the better football, but in the end, the Bengals remain undefeated by a score of 16-10. And in that game, the Steelers lost maybe their best offensive player in Le'Veon Bell to a gruesome knee injury, and he is out for the year now. So D'Angelo Williams is going to be taking over the reins now at running back for him. So maybe this is going to be a big hit for him, or maybe Williams can keep the production going that Bell did. One of the big games that everybody is talking about still is the Saints-Giants game. The game where Drew Brees and Eli Manning had a shootout, to put it quite frankly. I mean, a score of 52-49 is amazing. Drew Brees threw 7 touchdowns in the game, something that is very rare to do in the league. It's just amazing how that game went, especially for two teams who have been struggling the beginning of the year. Now, two teams that are putting up 40 to 50 points against each other in a good game. That was actually a really fun game to watch, and it seemed like it was going on forever. Another interesting game that wasn't so mainstream was the Bucs-Falcons game. And why it's so interesting is that the Atlanta Falcons, coming into the first 5-6 weeks, were maybe the best team in the NFL. Maybe the best team in the NFL. Or just the NFC. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are one of those teams that you don't know what they're going to do from week to week. Winston is slowly coming along as a good quarterback in this league and brings his team back to win 23-20 in overtime. The Buccaneers are, again, one of those teams that they're one of those young teams that they don't have a lot of veterans on the team, but the veterans that they do have are leaders. And with a group of young guys like this, in 2 or 3 years, they may be one of the top teams in the NFC. And then some of the later games, the Seahawks and the Dallas Cowboys, again, a tough matchup. Came down to maybe the last play of the game. Seahawks barely won the game with a score of 13-12. Neither offense played very well, but the defense on both sides of the ball was impressive the whole game. Now, Matt Castle was in for Dallas, but still, it was a very fun game to watch because it was a shootout defensively the entire game. And then the night game, which was another surprising factor to me, the Denver Broncos and the Green Bay Packers. The Broncos defensively just shut down Rodgers. And it's very surprising because Aaron Rodgers right now might be the best quarterback in the league. Tom Brady, I would still personally say, is the best. But Aaron Rodgers may be the guy that if you asked which one player in the league you would start your team with, Rodgers might be number one on most people's list. And to see that he didn't even throw for 100 yards is very surprising. The Broncos defense is one of those defenses where they might be able to carry the Broncos to the Super Bowl. Peyton Manning put up some good yards. He didn't have his best game, but he played pretty good enough to win the game. The running backs had a very good game, but the game was solely on the defense's shoulders. Wade Phillips is putting together a very good defense. Very good. Maybe the best in the league right now. And I was talking to some people, and it's kind of reminiscent of the Seahawks the last 2 or 3 years. The Seahawks are a team that their offense doesn't really carry them. The offense makes plays when it needs to, but it's the defense that carries that team. And the Denver Broncos right now are one of those teams where their defense is easily carrying that team. And then some other quick points. The injury front, there have been a lot of injuries these past couple weeks. As I said earlier, Le'Veon Bell went down. He's out for the year. Steve Smith, the guy who's been in the league for, it seems like, 20 years, is out for the year. Hopefully he can come back. And Bears running back Matt Forte injured his knee. He may be out for a couple of weeks, so it's going to be interesting to see if the Bears can still put it together offensively with maybe their best offensive player out of the game for the next couple weeks or however long it is, depending on how bad the injury is. Now, the next order of business here is a little discussion about trade deadline talk here. In the next couple of days, there's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of ideas and proposals and rumors out there about a lot of NFL players that might be traded, should be traded. And there's already been a couple ideas put out there that teams should do in order to better their teams. And what's unique about this year is the amount of high-quality potential trade targets there are this year. Kaepernick may be the number one. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, he has been struggling a lot. A lot. I don't know if it's the coaching staff because they have a defensive-minded head coach now. I don't know if it's the scheme that he's in. I don't know if he wants to leave the team because the head coach isn't there no more that he liked. I don't know if his mentality is on the right track right now to stay with the team. Maybe he needs a change of scenery in some sense. And a lot of people think that the Eagles should make a run at him. And there's some pros and cons to the Eagles trading for him. Now, the problem with that is that if you want a Colin Kaepernick type guy, you may have to give up, not necessarily a lot to get him, but you're going to have to give something up. It's not going to be a 6th round pick for him. There are some guys out there that were traded during the year where they got okay picks. When Jared Allen was traded from the Bears got a bottom round pick, like round 5 or 6. That's not what the 49ers are going to ask for. Kaepernick is going to demand a pretty decent trade if the Niners intend to trade him. So maybe the Eagles have to package Sam Bradford and a pick, or maybe they have to give up a defensive player that they can work with. Marcus Smith hasn't been playing really good football at all this year. Now, he hasn't played a lot, but the chances that he doesn't really do much with it. So maybe that's a guy that they can package in a deal where Jim Tomsula can maybe groom him and put him in a system that he might work better in. And in return, Kaepernick comes to the Eagles where maybe he can run a scheme that works beneficial to him. Now, that doesn't... But see, the whole thing that's interesting about this is that people think that if Kaepernick gets traded to the Eagles, all the problems in Philly are solved. They're automatically going to win every game. They're going to make a Super Bowl run, and Kaepernick's going to be the savior of the team. But there's still other question marks on that team. The offensive line, wide receivers right now are struggling to catch every pass. They need to get guys that can help on the field as well, not just the main quarterback spot. Now, I think Kaepernick would be pretty good in the Eagles scheme because it's a guy that he doesn't necessarily have to run, but he is at least have the threat to run. Where teams have to game plan for if he can run, then maybe that's what we have to scheme for instead of a guy like a Sam Bradford where they know he's not going to run. So they don't have to worry about the read option. If he's in the shotgun and DeMarco Murray's next to him, teams don't have to worry about him pulling the ball out of Murray's gut and running with it because it's not going to happen. Bradford is not the type of guy now. So Kaepernick is a guy that he necessarily isn't going to have plays built in where it's just a direct snap and he runs with it, but he at least has the threat of making that play happen if it has to. So if you want to trade for Colin Kaepernick, that's fine, but I don't see it happening. I think the 49ers are going to keep him. They may bench him a game just so he can get his head on right, give him time to think about the struggles that he's going through right now, and move on from there. Another couple interesting players that are right now rumored to be on the trade block are Cleveland Brown offensive linemen Alex Mack and Joe Thomas. And why this is so interesting is that Joe Thomas right now might be the best offensive tackle in the NFL. For the last 5-6 years, he's been probably the best left tackle in the league. He's made multiple Pro Bowls. He's getting up there in age, and he has a contract where it's not really friendly to a team that trades for him, but he is a guy that you can immediately put at your left tackle spot for at least probably 3 or 4 more years, and you don't have to worry about it. And maybe that's a guy that the Eagles look at. If Jason Kelsey also isn't a guy that you really look at as the future center, if he's starting to struggle, maybe you have to look at an Alex Mack. Or maybe Alex Mack can be a guard. Maybe you can trade for him and put him at left or right guard, and that helps the offensive line interior where you can run the ball more up the gut, which is what people want Murray to do on this team. And then a couple other guys that are out there, Matt Forte's name has been out there. To me, personally, I don't see the Bears trading him. Now, if Matt Forte doesn't want to re-sign, if he wants to go to a team that has the immediate chance of making the playoffs, like Denver or Dallas, when they're all back and healthy, Romo and everybody else, or a Patriots team, then maybe they have to trade him. Because if he's going to just get up and leave and you're not going to get anything for him, at least get maybe a 4th or 5th round pick. I wouldn't do it because he's half of your offense and you do have young backs where they can replace him, and you can run a committee of backs where you don't necessarily have to run just one guy for 20 or 30 times. But I don't think the Bears should trade Matt Forte at this time, especially if next year you get some good first-round picks on defense, you build the defense up, you make a run, you give Matt Forte a 2 or 3 year deal, let him finish his career as a Chicago Bear, let him retire, and move on from there. And another guy is Brian Cushing. Brian Cushing is another interesting one because he seems like the type of guy that wouldn't necessarily leave the team that he's on right now. Houston is a struggling team. They won yesterday, but still they are a struggling team. But I don't think Brian Cushing necessarily wants to leave. I don't think he's a guy that should leave. I think he's a guy that can immediately help your interior linebacking core. They have guys like Clowney and Watt, guys that are cornerstone pieces. But if Brian Cushing leaves, that leaves a major hole in the middle of that defense. And the struggles on the Houston Texans, to me, isn't necessarily the players. It's more or less the coaching staff. I think if you get a better defensive staff, you keep a guy like him there, and you go on from there. And that, to me, is what has to happen. Now, there were also some quick hits about earlier in the year, guys like Alshon Jeffrey might be traded. To me, that's not going to happen. And to me, there really aren't great wide receivers out there that are worthy of being traded. Steve Smith's name, for some reason, came up where he was in talks with somebody said that he might be traded to a playoff team because the Ravens are starting to struggle. I don't see that happening at all. That he's their number one guy. He's hurt right now. He comes back, he's still going to be their number one guy, or he retires, and that's that. So I don't see why his name would be up there. Another guy is Barkevious Mingo from the Browns. A lot of people don't really know him. He was a first-round pick a couple years back. A guy that has good talents, and a guy that maybe the Eagles should look to target. Because he's not a guy that you're going to have to give up a first-round pick for. You can maybe give up a third, a fourth-round pick, and maybe you can go from there, and you can build him up to be maybe the guy that Marcus Smith was going to be. Now, since it is the midway point or halfway point of the NFL year, I'm going to discuss the NFL draft coming up in May of 2016. And I know it may seem early, way too early. We don't even know who's making the playoffs. But each week, I myself like to look at who people think the teams are going to look to draft, or who they're at least considering. So I myself am going to do that here. And I'm just going to go through the first 15, 20 teams, basically the teams that aren't projected to make the playoffs. And it's not necessarily going to be a mock draft. I'm not going to say this is who I think they're going to take, but just to give my thoughts on who at least teams should look at. Maybe one or two players on who they should consider, or at least positions that they should look at least this point right now in the NFL year. So the Detroit Lions are the number one team right now in the draft order. They're a team that is struggling mightily right now, and they could go a lot of directions in the draft. And there's not a quarterback necessarily in the draft that is worthy of the number one pick, especially for a Detroit Lions team where Matthew Stafford, granted, is struggling right now to really put up the numbers and put up the games that he used to, at least even last year. But I don't think there's an Andrew Luck type guy that you can take number one and start over Matthew Stafford, who can lead your team to the, playoffs in some sense. So there are a couple positions that they could look at. Running back is a position that they could look at. Now, Amir Abdullah was a draft pick that they had. Joique Bell's there. Theo Riddick's still there. And they're all a committee of backs that can work well on that team. But there's not one guy that can carry the ball 30 times. You can put the ball in his hands, and you know that he's going to get 4 or 5 yards each carry. Ezekiel Elliott is a guy that can get that done for him. Not necessarily with the number one pick. Maybe you trade back if you look at a guy like him. But he's a guy that maybe you could at least consider if you don't think the offensive or the running back committee that you have right now is working out as well as you thought it would. You could also look at offensive line. Riley Reif was a first-round pick a few years back for him. Laken Tomlinson was their first-round pick from this year, an offensive guard. So they've got some good key pieces on the offensive line, but their offensive line is struggling a lot right now too. Much like a lot of their positions are on the team, their offensive line is struggling a lot now too. And there are a couple offensive tackles out there who are worthy of the number one pick. Ronnie Stanley from Notre Dame is a guy that you could probably take with the number one pick, feel safe with that pick, put him at the left tackle or right tackle spot for the next 10 years. I'm not going to call him a Hall of Famer or a Pro Bowl guy yet, but he's a guy that you can at least take with the number one pick and feel safe saying that this is a great pick. Laramie Tunsil from Ole Miss is another guy too, that he's a big guy. He was a great recruit out of high school and has lived up to the expectations. The first couple games he came out, he didn't play, but when he's played very well. So that's a guy that could maybe fight for that number one spot. And there are also some positions on defense that you can kind of look at too. Cornerback is a spot where maybe you can look at and consider a guy like a Jalen Ramsey or a Vernon Hargreaves. Two cornerbacks that are probably NFL ready. I don't think they're necessarily, when Patrick Peterson came out in the draft three or 4 years back, I don't think they're guys that you can immediately put on the team and he'll be your shutdown number one guy or worthy of a number one pick. But those are just two guys that you have to consider at this point. Because the Lions may not end up with the number one pick. They may end up with the 5 or 6 pick. They may go on and win 3 or 4 more games. But this is who you at least have to look at right now. The Tennessee Titans are the next one up with the number 2 spot, and it's ironic because they were number 2 last year as well. And much like the Detroit Lions, they're not going to go for quarterback either. Marcus Mariota is their guy. They're going to run with him, so why not build around him both offensively and defensively? And they are in a position, much like the Detroit Lions are, where they have some struggling parts on both the offense and defensive side. Running back is definitely the number one spot. Ezekiel Elliott would be perfect on this team. Mariota is there. Kendall Wright's there. Dorial Green-Beckham's there. You have a good young group of wide receivers. Your offensive line isn't too bad, but there's no run game. Ezekiel Elliott is the guy that you can give the ball to, and he can be the guy to run the ball 25 times and get in the red zone and get in the end zone every game. And he's done that so far at Ohio State. So he, to me, would be a perfect guy for the Tennessee Titans. Maybe not with the number 2 spot, but he's definitely a guy that they need to look at. And they could also maybe look at some cornerbacks as well, and maybe a safety. But right now, I think Ezekiel Elliott would be the number 1 guy for him. At the number 3 spot, the Baltimore Ravens. A pretty surprising spot. A team that was in the playoffs last year. Could have maybe made a Super Bowl run, but they fell short. Right now, they're really falling short in the 2015 year. So, with projected with the number 3 pick, they have some options as well. Forset's still there. Steve Smith got hurt, but he may come back. Rashad Perriman, their first-round pick, hasn't played yet. And I'm not going to call a bust because he wasn't a top 5 pick and he's not struggling. He just needs to get on the field first. But with that said, maybe wide receiver is what you need to go look for in this draft. Because quite frankly, there are some very good wide receivers. Laquan Treadwell from Ole Miss, to me, is the number 1 guy. He is an Alshon Jeffrey type guy. He's a guy that he's big, he has size, his hands are great catching the ball. He has everything that you want out of a number 1 guy. Now, he doesn't necessarily have that Amari Cooper, Kevin White sort of X factor to him, because Kevin White was a guy that came out that was just, for his size, he was just so fast, and Amari Cooper was a guy that could play in any scheme and catch any ball that was thrown to him. Laquan Treadwell, to me, is a guy that has good hands, but he doesn't really have that X factor. He's just kind of a big guy that can run really good routes and catch the ball very well, but he's still probably worthy of a top 10 pick, and the Ravens maybe should look at a guy like him. Cornerback, or just in general, the secondary is maybe another position that they need to look at. Their cornerbacks and their defense in general is struggling a lot. And you also have to look at the outside linebackers. Terrell Suggs isn't getting any younger. He's eventually going to retire. So maybe you have to look at a replacement for him. A guy like Leonard Floyd, Georgia, he's a great outside linebacker. A guy that he's not necessarily going to get you 20 sacks and be a sack leader and be a defensive player of the year type guy yet, but he's a guy that can play it in a lot of schemes the way that the Ravens kind of play it now. So that's what the Ravens should look at. They should look at wide receiver and some help on the secondary and the outside linebacker spot. The Cleveland Browns are up next. And this is really interesting as well because they have had some good picks over the last few years. Danny Shelton was a guy who I liked coming out of the draft. I didn't necessarily like him as a top 10 or top 12 pick. I thought he was a good defensive tackle. He's not playing too good right now, but it's only his rookie year, so you got to give him time to develop with the staff that he has and the teammates that he has. But in the next 2 or 3 years, he should really develop into a good defensive lineman. But it's really interesting because this is a team, this is one of those X Factor teams where they could go anywhere in the draft. They could go anywhere. They could go, I don't know, quarterback number 1, running back number 1. They could go defensive lineman again. They could go middle linebacker, corner. They could go anywhere in the draft. And maybe this is where you need to start looking at the quarterback spot. Maybe this is where the quarterback spot starts to take focus. Because while McCown is playing very good ball, he's not getting younger. He's in his mid-30s. Eventually, he's going to retire from that team. Manziel, to me, is not the answer at all. And it's not from any off-the-field stuff. It's simply because, to me, he doesn't have the skill. He's small for a guy at that spot. His arm strength really isn't there. Granted, he's fast for his spot that he plays at, but he's still not a guy that, to me, can make every throw, a guy that can basically take over a team and win games for him. But he's at least a decent backup. So maybe this is where Connor Cook comes in. Maybe Jared Goff from Cal. Maybe this is where you start to look at these spots. It's going to be, the Browns are definitely one of those teams that, to me, I don't know what they're going to do. They can go anywhere in the draft, and it wouldn't be a surprise. The San Diego Chargers, another surprising team. A team that I thought that would be much better than they are now. I thought Melvin Gordon would be a lot better than he is, and quite frankly, he's struggling a lot more than I thought. I thought he would be a guy that I don't think he would be playing the way that Todd Gurley's playing, because Todd Gurley's just on his own level at this point. But I thought that Melvin Gordon would be at least be a guy that gets you consistent yards and can be up for at least Offensive Rookie of the Year. But right now, he's struggling. Maybe you have to build up the offensive line. Maybe he just needs some help. I don't know what it is. Maybe you need to look at offensive linemen. Maybe you need to look at some interior guards. But for a top 5 pick, you can't look at that spot. So maybe this is where you got to start looking at defensive linemen now. Bosa, Joey Bosa from Ohio State is a guy that maybe this is where you start to look at. Maybe you start to look at Bosa as a guy that here's where he goes. Because quite frankly, Joey Bosa coming into this year was a guy that many people thought was going to be the number 1 unheralded pick. Guaranteed number 1 pick, J.J. Watt type guy. And I think Bosa has the talent to be a very good defensive end in this league. But I don't think he's J.J. Watt. He's just not. And that's because J.J. Watt is, quite frankly, a freak. I mean, he's built like somebody made him in a lab. And the way he plays is unmatched maybe by any defensive lineman maybe ever in the NFL. Bosa is a guy that he's definitely going to be probably a top 5, top 6 pick, but I don't necessarily see the number 1 pick. But the Lions could look at that. They might want to look at defensive linemen at this point. I mean, they're one of those teams where they could have help anywhere. So maybe he goes number 1, like most people say, or he falls maybe in the 4 to 6 spot. Chargers are a team that they could go a lot of different spots in the draft, but I would say maybe offensive lineman or defensive line would be where they should target. Now, with the San Francisco 49ers up at the number 6 spot, this is where I think the quarterbacks start. This is where I think the quarterback spot really starts, because if Kaepernick isn't your guy, Jared Goff from Cal might be a match made in heaven at this point. Jared Goff plays at Cal, which is kind of similar to where San Francisco is playing. So if Jared Goff is from that area, plays in the same state where the Niners play, and the Niners need a quarterback, it kind of makes sense for them to be together in that sense. Jared Goff is a guy, though, that he's not an Andrew Luck. He's not going to be a guy that you can put at the number 1 spot, give him the keys to the team and say, have fun, go win us a Super Bowl or whatever. He's not that guy. He's a guy that has a lot of potential to be a great quarterback, but he's going to need maybe another year. And there are some rumblings that he may not even come out this year if he continues to struggle. I mean, if he doesn't come out, maybe Connor Cook is the number 1 guy then. But right now, to me, San Fran looks like a team that they could have help at the quarterback spot right now. Wide receiver spot you could also look at. If Vernon Davis is gone, you might want to look at the tight end spot, but there's no tight ends that are, quite frankly, worthy of a first-round pick. So you're not going to look at that spot. Maybe you also address the inside linebacker spot. Willis is gone. Navarro Bowman right now is playing at a good level. But Jalen Smith is the best inside linebacker right now, a guy that can play in multiple schemes. He can play outside, inside, middle. He could play all over the linebacking core. So maybe San Fran looks at him as the heir apparent in the San Fran history of linebackers. Next up after them is the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, this is another interesting team because their number 1 pick, Dante Fowler, got hurt in the beginning of the year. He hasn't played. So it's kind of like they're getting 2 first-round picks this year. Fowler hasn't played, so no team knows what he's going to be like. He may be a stud, he may be a bust, but no one knows until the year starts. This is another team where they could go a lot of different spots. But to me, cornerback is where they should go. Ramsey is a guy that he has size. He played safety. He's playing cornerback now. He can play all over the secondary for a team that the offense is coming together, a bunch of young guys playing together on the same level. Their defense is struggling, but somewhat keeping their team in games, but they just need another maybe key playmaker on defense. And Jalen Ramsey would be a guy that might work for that team best. Now, after the Jaguars, we have the Chicago Bears. Now, this is a team that many had as having the first round pick before the year began. Many people said this is where Jared Goff or Connor Cook was going to go. Cutler is playing above and beyond what he usually is. And the quarterback spot is not what they need. What they need is defense. Defense, defense, defense. If Robert Nkemdiche is there at that spot, I take him and run with it. I run up to the podium, fill out that card, hand it in, and celebrate. Because he's a guy that would match this defense perfectly because he can fit in multiple schemes, and it's a position that we need. Inside linebacker is another spot where I think you could definitely look at. They need help on the defensive side. Quite frankly, I think their whole draft could be devoted to the defense at this point. I don't know if they need help in the secondary in the first round or the defensive line in the first round. All I know is that defense has to be their first pick in that draft. And Kevin White didn't play, or at least hasn't played this year. So you're going to be getting 2 first-round picks in one, basically, in next year's draft. After that, Dallas. This is a team that I don't see being at the spot that it is. Romo, when he comes back, Dallas is going to win some more games. But if I'm looking at the Dallas team right now, I think they could use a lot of help on the secondary as well. They got Byron Jones in this year's draft, which can help, but I think they need help on the defense. And it's kind of funny because this is a team where I don't really see one key weakness. I don't. Maybe running back. But Darren McFadden, the way he's playing right now, if he can continue that, running back is not what they need then. So this is a team that is kind of one of those X-Factor teams where they can go anywhere in the draft. Elliott would be a match made in heaven. He would be a guy that if you put him in there, you might as well give him 1,400 yards. Because if Darren McFadden can get 1,000 yards, if he can get 1,000 yards out of the offensive line, Elliott can definitely get that. So that's another one of those X-Factor teams, but I don't necessarily see them staying at that spot. The Houston Texans are the next team up, and this is where Christian Hackenberg needs to go. Christian Hackenberg had his best year at Penn State with Bill O'Brien. And Bill O'Brien has no quarterback on his team right now that can win games. And if Christian Hackenberg is there for that team, they need to go out and get him immediately. And this is another one of those picks where if I'm able to get him, I run to the podium, celebrate, and move on because Christian Hackenberg on that team would make that team maybe a playoff team 2-3 years down the road. That is the only player that I look at for that team. I don't think Hackenberg right now is a top 3 pick. I think he has top 3 pick talent, but I necessarily don't think he's going to go in the top 3. And if Houston is there, even if I'm Houston and if I have the number 1 pick, Hackenberg would be the number 1 pick for me. That's how I look at it. Hackenberg is the perfect pick for him, and I'm not even going to discuss it anymore because that's what it has to be. The Kansas City Chiefs are up next. This is another team where they are one of those X-Factor teams, much like a couple other teams, where they can be slotted at any player. You can take any player in that draft at that spot, and I don't think fans would worry at all. They took Marcus Peters in the first round. He's a great young secondary player right now. 2-3 years, maybe a top 10 cornerback. They don't need necessarily that much help at any one position. You could maybe go defensive line. A guy like Ashawn Robinson from Alabama may be a guy. DeForest Buckner from Oregon may be a guy. who's 6'8", 300 pounds, kind of like Eric Armstead in last year's draft, a guy that can play on the defensive line, that can clog holes, that can play next to a Dontari Poe, can give Justin Houston looks to blitz the quarterback. It's one of those picks where they can go anywhere, and I don't think teams would really mind it. Alex Smith is still there. He's not a guy that's necessarily going to win you a lot of games. He can get you to the playoffs. He's one of those guys where he can get you to the playoffs, but he's not going to win you much. He's not an Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck, Tom Brady, Manning. He's not one of those guys, but he's a guy that can win you games. So I don't necessarily look at the quarterback spot at that pick just yet. After the Kansas City Chiefs, we have the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Miami Dolphins are one of those teams where they are like the Tampa Bay Bucks a year or so back. The Tampa Bay Bucks were one of those teams where they addressed a lot of their needs in free agency by signing guys. They signed Ndamukong Suh. People thought that defensive line was good to go. Philbin was let go after a couple weeks. Dan Campbell came in. Dan Campbell is making them a pretty good team now. But this is a team where, again, you can go a lot of different spots. I look at offensive line. Brandon Albert seems to always be hurt. They just need help on the interior, on the tackles, they need help everywhere on the offense. The offensive line is maybe its strength and its weakness at the same time, because when all the guys are healthy and ready to go, they can be pretty good. They're a pretty good team. They're pretty good players. Albert was at one time a top 10, top 15 tackle. He's just never healthy now. So offensive line is maybe where you need to go. Stanley, Tunsil aren't going to be there. Taylor Decker, though, from Ohio State probably will be. He's not a Stanley or Tunsil type talent. He's not going to be a top 5 pick, but he's a guy that you can definitely take in the first round and have confidence that he can be an offensive tackle for you for 7, 8, 9 years. But that's a team where they could use help on the linebacking core as well, where a Jalen Smith would be perfect. But to me, Jalen Smith isn't going to make it. So maybe you look at a guy like a Miles Jack, a guy that can play outside linebacker or inside. He can play everywhere. Now, we got hurt, so maybe you can get him in the second round if that's what some teams think. But he's definitely a guy that you should look at. After the Miami Dolphins, we have the Tampa Bay Bucks. Now, they addressed their main quarterback spot last year with the number 1 pick. Winston's playing pretty good for what he has. They're another team that you could use a lot of help on the offensive line. But after Tunsil, Stanley, and Decker, I don't know if there's an offensive lineman worthy of a top 10 pick. So in that regard, maybe you have to go defense. Maybe you can go corner, or maybe you can go safety. There aren't really any safeties out there that are worthy of a top pick. A guy like Jalen Mills was a top talent maybe in last year's draft. He's coming out this year, most likely coming out. But maybe you can use help on the safety spots. Safeties, corner. Jaron Kirsch from Clemson is a guy that I like. He's not a top 20 pick. He may not even be a first round pick, but he's a guy. He kind of reminds me of a Cam Chancellor type player. 6'4", 220 pounds, a guy that can play linebacker if you really need him to in certain spots, that maybe in the late first, early second round, a team can target. So the Bucs, to me, maybe can look defense or offensive line. After the Tampa Bay Bucs, we have the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles are one of those interesting teams. If they don't get Colin Kaepernick, and Sam Bradford's not the guy, are you willing to draft a quarterback? Are you willing to draft a quarterback like a Cardale Jones? A guy who could fit in Chip Kelly's scheme, but necessarily is struggling right now. He's a guy that coming into this year could have maybe been a first round, could have maybe been a top 3 pick. But the Eagles will definitely have a chance at him now. He is struggling. Do you take a risk on him and maybe he works out? Maybe he doesn't work out. Maybe you get the quarterback that was in the national championship last year, or you get the quarterback that's playing now, a guy who's has one game where he's a superstar and then the next game he has to be replaced. I don't know about that. Offensive line is another thing that I discussed earlier. That's a spot where even though there's no real offensive lineman worthy of that spot at a top 15 pick, maybe you have to take him at this point. And outside linebacker is another spot. Leonard Floyd, as I said earlier, would be a great pick for the Eagles. They need help on the outside linebacker spots. I understand. Barwin's there. Brandon Graham's there. But those aren't guys that you can play every single snap and not give them time to rest, especially if this defense is going to continue to allow teams to be on the field for 40-plus minutes. So outside linebacker, quarterback, offensive lineman are, to me, the top three spots, and wide receiver. I cannot leave out the wide receiver spot. And this is interesting because, to me, Treadwell will not be there, but there are two wide receivers that will be there that I think could be very good on this team. Michael Thomas from Ohio State is a guy that has size. He has Laquan Treadwell type size. He's like 6'3", 200-plus pounds, a guy that he necessarily isn't, he doesn't have that superstar status in the draft. He doesn't have that notable factor. He plays on the best team right now in college, but he doesn't have that X factor. Another guy is Corey Coleman. Corey Coleman is a wide receiver that I really like. He kind of reminds me of an Odell Beckham Jr. And I'm not comparing his ability to catch the ball to Odell, because that is rare. I mean, there are maybe only 3 or 4 other guys in the league that can catch like that. But Corey Coleman is a guy that has speed. He's only about 6 foot, but he has size for being 6 foot. He's big. And he's a guy that maybe you can have him and Aguilar on the outside, Matthews on the inside in the slot, which a lot of people want him to truly be. Or maybe you go with a Michael Thomas, a guy that has a little bit of everything. Not necessarily one key thing about him, but has a couple things. So you can look at wideout, offensive lineman, quarterback, outside linebacker. Those are the spots that the Eagles should look at. Now I'm going to run through a couple quick teams before I go here. The Buffalo Bills are a team that maybe they can look at outside linebacker help or defensive end help because their position really isn't truly there. Maybe offensive lineman. Their running back position should be set with LaShawn McCoy there right now. The New Orleans Saints are another team that maybe you have to look at a replacement for Drew Brees. They got Garrett Grayson last year in the draft. Maybe he can be the replacement for Brees. Who knows at this point? Maybe you got to look at a replacement for a Marquise Colston type guy. I liked some of the receivers that they have on the team. Brandon Cooks is a great guy. I don't know if he's necessarily a number one guy that you can throw to 15 times and he'll catch every single ball, but he's a guy that you can definitely rely on in the game. He can definitely be the deep threat, a Deshaun Jackson type guy. And the St. Louis Rams are another team at the number 20 spot, rounding out the list here. The St. Louis Rams are one of those teams where their quarterback spot is kind of spotty at this point. Maybe this is where you look at a Connor Cook. If Connor Cook falls to 20, are the Rams that confident in Nick Foles? Because to me, the Rams have won solely because of a Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley has put that team on his back, and that defense put that team on his back. That defense, to me, is ready to go. You don't need, to me, to invest any high picks on that defense. To me, you look solely at the offense. The offensive line should be good to go soon. The running back spot is set. Tight end you could look at, but there's no tight ends worthy of a number one pick. So maybe you look at wideout. Tavon Austin was one of their picks a couple years back in the first round, but he's not really a number one guy. He's kind of a do-it-all, kind of like a Darren Sproles. Maybe they can look at a Corey Coleman or a Michael Thomas if one of those two guys are still there. Or a Tyler Boyd from Pitt, who was regarded as being a top wide receiver before the year started. If he's still there, maybe they can look at him. But is quarterback a position that the Rams need to look at? Sean Mannion was a guy that they took in the draft, where he was good at Oregon State, but I don't know if he's necessarily better than a Connor Cook. I think Connor Cook is a guy that has great talent. I think he's a guy that is definitely worthy of a first-round pick, maybe even a top 10 pick, depending on if a team really needs him that bad. And I don't know if Nick Foles is the answer there. Nick Foles makes some decent plays, but it's Nick Foles. Nick Foles doesn't have that X factor. Nick Foles doesn't have that it factor. He doesn't have that guy. He doesn't have that guy inside of him where if you're down by 6, you need to score to win with 2 minutes left. I don't see that in him. Now, I'm not saying Connor Cook necessarily is that guy right now either, but I think Connor Cook has the potential to be that guy. And at the number 20 spot, Connor Cook is a steal. Because Connor Cook going into this year was seen as maybe being maybe even the top 3, maybe even the number 1 pick. And it's kind of funny because this is a year where the quarterback spot really isn't that needed. Last year in the draft, you could have had 4 or 5 teams that might have taken a quarterback in the first round, but there were only really 2 that are worthy of a first-round pick. But this year, you have upwards of potentially 4 quarterbacks that are worthy of a first-round pick, and you don't have 3 or 4 clear teams that need a quarterback, with the exception of maybe the Texans and 1 or 2 other teams. But the Texans are really that team. The Texans and maybe the Browns are the only 2 teams that you could really say that team needs it. Connor Cook needs that team. Christian Hackenberg would be perfect on that team. As I said earlier, Hackenberg to the Texans, perfect pick. That, to me, should already be set in stone unless he plays a lot better the remainder of the year, or he stays, or if Hackenberg stays. Because none of these quarterbacks are necessarily slated to automatically come out, with the exception of maybe Cook. But a guy like Hackenberg, a guy like Goff can stay in for another year, hone their skills, and maybe go out next year where a team like the Bears maybe look at a Hackenberg or a Goff in the first round. So that's my discussion on the upcoming draft next year. A couple other quick points. Sixers are playing the Cavaliers. It's going to be a tough game to watch. Other than that, Eagles are on their bye week, but coming up this week, they come back. And tune in on Friday at 9 a.m. I will be back on, and I will discuss some improvements that the Eagles should make in order to win their next game. Thank you, everybody, for listening in to my show. I'll be back Friday at 9 a.m. You're listening to 98.5 WNUW LP Aston.